cultural life. Her image appeared in literature, music, and visual art, inspiring new generations to reflect on the meaning of courage and leadership. And so, Chapter 9 concludes with a profound realization that Nanny of the Maroons did not merely lead resistance in her lifetime. She shaped the psychological and political landscape of Jamaica across centuries, influencing how freedom was imagined, defended, and eventually institutionalized. And her story stands as enduring testament that organized defiance against empire can alter history's course long after the first shots fade into silence. As we enter this final chapter, the mountains stand as silent witnesses to everything that is unfolded. Mist still rolls across the Blue Mountains, just as it did centuries ago. The wind still moves through tall trees, as if carrying echoes of distant voices, and in that wind there remains a story that refuses to fade. The story of Nanny of the Maroons, a woman taken in chains who rose to lead a resistance that forced the British Empire to recognize what it once tried to crush. And when we look back across her life, we do not see only ambushes and musket fire. We see intelligence shaped by hardship. We see discipline built from necessity. We see leadership forged in the darkest conditions imaginable. And we see something greater than battle. We see the transformation of fear into strategy, and strategy into freedom. Because Nanny understood that survival required more than courage. It required unity, communication, spiritual grounding, and the ability to adapt when circumstances changed. And through these qualities she turned scattered escapees into an organized force. She turned mountains into fortresses. She turned uncertainty into direction. And she forced an empire built on expansion to pause and negotiate, and that pause altered the history of Jamaica forever. Her legacy did not end when the treaty was signed. It did not end when she passed from this world. It continued through generations who carried her lessons in their daily lives, through children who grew up free in the mountains, through elders who retold her story beside evening fires, through communities that maintained culture despite centuries of colonial pressure and long after slavery ended and Jamaica moved toward independence. Her name stood as proof that resistance was not new to the island. It was rooted deeply in its soil and in modern times when she was named a national hero. Her recognition was not a gift from history. It was a restoration of truth, an acknowledgement that freedom on that island was shaped not only by political documents, but by a woman who refused to kneel. And scholars continue studying her life. Artists continue painting her image. Musicians continue singing her name, because she represents something universal. The idea that even in systems designed to erase humanity, leadership grounded in courage and wisdom can bend the direction of power. When we reflect on her journey, we must understand that it was not simple. It carried sacrifice. It carried moral complexity. It carried moments of doubt and heavy responsibility. Yet through all of it, she chose endurance over surrender. And that choice resonates across centuries because empires rise believing they are permanent. Yet history teaches that permanence is an illusion. What truly lasts is the spirit of those who challenge injustice with clarity and resolve. And Nanny did exactly that. She challenged not only the British military, but the belief that enslaved Africans were powerless. She proved that organization could counter superior weapons. She proved that unity could overcome division. And she proved that identity could survive displacement. And today, when we speak her name, we are not only remembering the past, we are recognizing a blueprint for resilience in the present. And now, as we close this powerful story here on History of Forgotten Souls, we ask you to reflect deeply. What part of Nanny's journey stayed with you the most? Was it her escape into the mountains, her strategy against British forces, her role in shaping a treaty that changed history, or the way her legacy carried forward into modern Jamaica? Tell us in the comments where you are watching from, your city, your country, and what time it is right now, because this community stretches across the world, just like her story has stretched across centuries. If you have not already subscribed, make sure you subscribe to History of Forgotten Souls and like this video so more people can discover the forgotten heroes who shaped our world. Share this story with someone who believes that true history deserves to be remembered. And stay with us, because the next forgotten soul we uncover may change the way you see the past forever. Until next time, remember this: history is not only written by empires, it is also written by those who refuse to disappear. Visible confidence even when private fears whispered quietly in the background. Instead of allowing worry to divide the people, she strengthened traditions that kept everyone united. Gatherings were held where stories of bravery were shared again and again, where the ancestors were remembered with respect, and where the reason for their struggle was spoken clearly so no one would forget. Freedom was never described as a distant idea or a dream. It was spoken of as something alive and necessary for their survival. And while the British prepared for even larger campaigns, determined to destroy the Maroons completely, Nanny prepared as well. She understood that the coming confrontations would decide whether the mountains would remain a safe refuge or turn into a graveyard for resistance. The air itself seemed full of tension, as both sides slowly moved toward a decisive moment in Jamaica's history. As the decades continued to pass and Jamaica entered new periods of colonial control, economic growth, and political pressure, the influence of Nanny's resistance did not fade. Instead, it quietly grew deeper beneath the surface of history. Chapter 7 unfolds during a time when the island's sugar economy still pushed the demand for enslaved labor. Ships continued crossing the Atlantic Ocean. Plantations kept expanding further into the land. Yet the presence of Maroon communities stood as a living contradiction to the belief that slavery was permanent and unchallenged. High in the mountains, free black settlements survived and flourished under agreements that had been forced through years of struggle. This reality unsettled colonial confidence. Even though open war had ended, the memory of those battles shaped every meeting between the Maroons and British officials. Whenever a colonial leader considered tightening control, the lessons of earlier conflicts seemed to whisper caution, reminding them of the high cost of underestimating organized resistance. Inside Moortown and the other windward settlements, the culture that Nanny helped establish grew into a structured society built on shared land, collective protection, and spiritual continuity. Elders placed strong emphasis on discipline among the young. They taught tracking skills, knowledge of healing plants, and the history of their people, treating each lesson as an equally important form of strength. Survival required awareness not only of the forest paths, but also of the political forces surrounding them. The abeng horn still sounded during community gatherings. Sometimes it was used as a signal, other times as part of ceremony, its echo moving through valleys that once carried the loud crack of musket fire. This steady continuation of tradition ensured that identity remained rooted in memory rather than fading with time. During these gatherings, stories about Nanny were repeated with rich detail. People spoke about her calm eyes during moments of danger, her refusal to bow in spirit before empire, and her understanding that the mountains could act as both fortress and teacher. These stories did not celebrate domination or power over others. Instead, they encouraged pride in resilience and endurance. Yet the island itself was changing. Enslaved populations on plantations kept growing larger. Frustration and resentment slowly built beneath the weight of forced labor, and quiet whispers of rebellion occasionally appeared across different parishes. Within those whispers, the memory of the Maroons remained like a distant signal, reminding people that resistance could succeed when the right conditions existed. Colonial authorities remained alert to this influence. At times they praised the Maroons for respecting treaty agreements. At other times they watched them with suspicion, uncertain whether the peace represented loyalty or simply careful patience. This fragile balance shaped Jamaica's social landscape throughout the 18th century. It demonstrated that power on the island was never completely absolute. It was negotiated, challenged, and sometimes redirected by people who refused silent submission. As the century moved toward its later years, and global events began shifting the Atlantic world, the memory of Nanny's organized resistance gained new meaning. Revolutions in other places, including the American colonies and later Saint-Domingue, which would become Haiti, began shaking the established order. Across the Caribbean, enslaved populations started questioning systems that had long been presented as unchangeable. Even though the Maroons of Jamaica maintained their own separate agreements, the larger symbol of a successful struggle against British military campaigns could not be erased. Centuries later, historians would observe how early Maroon resistance helped shape colonial policy, not only in Jamaica, but throughout the Caribbean region. European powers were forced to reconsider their assumptions about control in mountainous territories and among organized communities capable of defending themselves. In this way, Chapter 7 closes with a powerful realization. Nanny's life was not limited to her own generation. Her influence moved forward through cultural memory, political caution, and the persistent belief that freedom, once experienced and defended, can shape societies long after the original battles have faded into history. As the 18th century continued, and Jamaica remained under British colonial rule, the island existed with tension beneath the surface. Plantations produced enormous wealth for distant investors, yet the memory of resistance remained alive in the hills. Chapter 8 begins in a world filled with contradiction. On one side stood luxury created by sugar profits. On the other stood labor forced through violence and control. High above the cane fields, Maroon communities continued living under their treaty, their guarded independence woven into everyday life. Although Nanny herself belonged to an earlier generation, her presence seemed to move through time. It lived in stories, in proverbs, and in the quiet confidence of people who understood that their survival had once depended on her leadership. This inherited strength shaped how the Windward Maroons faced the changing political world around them. Colonial officials could never fully relax, because the mountains that once hid organized rebellion still stood as silent reminders of vulnerability. Even though our formal war had ended many years earlier, fear never disappeared completely. It simply changed form and became caution. Governors maintained communication with Maroon leaders, sometimes requesting cooperation and sometimes offering small concessions to preserve stability. This relationship created a unique political arrangement within Jamaica. It was neither complete separation nor full integration. Instead, it was a careful coexistence, built on the hard lessons learned during earlier conflicts. Within Maroon towns, children were taught more than hunting and farming. They were also taught diplomacy. History had already shown that force alone cannot secure lasting freedom. Strength must also be supported by awareness, wisdom, and negotiation. Meanwhile, on plantations throughout the island, enslaved workers listened carefully to small pieces of Maroon history passed quietly from one person to another. Those fragments carried powerful meaning. They revealed that organized resistance had once forced an empire to bargain. They reminded people that mountains had sheltered freedom, and that leadership built on unity could challenge systems believed impossible to break. Although the Maroons respected treaty agreements that limited direct involvement in plantation rebellions, their very existence continued to inspire imagination among the enslaved population. Symbols play an important role in shaping courage, and the symbol of Nanny, fierce, disciplined, and spiritually grounded, remained alive in memory, representing both what had already been achieved and what might one day become possible again. As world events reshaped the Atlantic region, especially the Haitian Revolution that began in 1791, conversations about resistance grew louder across the Caribbean. Jamaica's colonial government watched these developments with deep concern, because news of successful rebellion elsewhere threatened the stability of plantation society. In this tense atmosphere, the earlier example of the Maroons gained renewed importance. Officials understood that mountainous terrain combined with organized leadership could dramatically change the outcome of conflicts. Scholars in later centuries would study how early Maroon resistance influenced colonial defensive strategies throughout the Caribbean, shaping military planning and political decisions long after the muskets had fallen silent during Nanny's lifetime. Chapter 8 therefore reveals not dramatic battles, but something equally powerful. It shows the quiet continuation of a legacy that shaped political caution, cultural pride, and collective memory. Through this perspective, Nanny's story rises beyond her own lifetime and becomes part of the structural foundation of Jamaican history. It reminds us that resistance once forced recognition, and that recognition changed the island's future in ways that still echo today. After the treaty was signed in 1739, the mountains did not become spiritually silent, even though gunfire became far less common. Peace created through negotiation often carries hidden tension beneath the surface. Nanny understood that recognition from the British did not erase the memory of chains, or the awareness that empire often searches for advantage even after agreements are signed. Because of this, she remained watchful, guiding her people through a new and uncertain period where freedom existed, but trust remained fragile. Within the windward settlements, everyday life slowly shifted from survival warfare toward building stable communities. Fields were cultivated more openly, homes were strengthened, children grew up without the constant fear of sudden attacks. Yet every elder still remembered the years of conflict, and those memories shaped their view of the future. Nanny encouraged balance. She advised vigilance without falling into fear, cooperation without surrender, and unity without becoming careless. She believed that maintaining freedom requires as much discipline as winning it in the first place. Inside the Maroon towns, systems of governance became more organized. Councils met regularly to settle disagreements and manage land. Hunting and farming were planned carefully to protect resources for future generations. Communication with colonial authorities was handled with caution in order to prevent misunderstandings that might restart conflict. Nanny's influence continued guiding these decisions, even when she did not personally lead every meeting. Leadership rooted deeply in a community does not disappear quickly. It becomes part of culture, and culture preserves identity through changing seasons. As the years passed, children who had never experienced the early years of war grew up hearing stories about the struggle that had secured their freedom. Those stories shaped their understanding of who they were and what their community represented. Through memory, discipline, and shared purpose, the legacy of resistance continued quietly, ensuring that the mountains remained not only a refuge of land, but also a refuge of history and identity. Of harsh mountain fighting, grew up listening to stories of surprise attacks, of secret paths, of nights when the Aben's horn echoed across the valleys. And those stories did not celebrate violence. Instead, they encouraged awareness, reminding every generation that their freedom had been earned through sacrifice and courage. This awareness strengthened their feeling of belonging and duty toward their community. Yet Chapter 5 also holds complexity because treaties with colonial powers rarely come without strict conditions. Among those conditions was an agreement that the Maroons would assist colonial authority in capturing future runaways, a clause that created deep moral tension within the community. Historians still continue debating the meaning and impact of that obligation. When examining this chapter, we must face the difficult truth that survival sometimes requires decisions shaped by outside pressure. Nanny's era existed inside a world ruled by empire, trade, and political compromise, and although she fought fiercely against slavery and defended her people's independence, she also moved within a landscape where perfect solutions were rarely possible. This complexity does not reduce her bravery. Instead, it deepens our understanding of the environment in which she led, because leadership in history often means choosing between imperfect options rather than ideal ones. Through everything, she kept her focus on protecting Maroon identity, culture, and land as strong anchors against being absorbed into plantation society. As her later years unfolded, she became more than a military strategist. She became a powerful symbol of spiritual and cultural continuity. Oral traditions remember her as a respected, austere woman whose presence inspired confidence, unity, and belief. Whether one views these accounts as literal truth or symbolic memory, their survival shows how deeply she shaped collective identity, because symbols play an important role in keeping communities strong across generations. When she finally passed from this world, most likely in the early 18th century, her legacy did not end. Instead, it expanded. Her name became permanently connected to the Windward Maroons, to the settlement later known as Moortown, and to the wider story of resistance on the island of Jamaica. Centuries later, she would be officially honored as a national hero, yet long before statues and formal recognition appeared, her memory already lived in songs, in quiet stories, whispered beneath mountain trees, and in the confidence of a people who understood that their freedom was neither accidental nor temporary. It had been secured by a woman who refused to surrender when empire expected obedience. Chapter 5 closes not with a final ending, but with continuation. Nanny's story moved forward into history, not as a single moment of rebellion, but as a foundation upon which later generations would build their understanding of courage, strategy, and resilience when facing overwhelming power. As the years moved on after the treaty, the form of resistance changed, yet its spirit never disappeared. Chapter 6 begins in a quieter period, a time when smoke no longer rose every day from musket fire. Still, the memory of struggle remained alive in every household. Nanny's presence, whether through her living influence or through her legacy depending on the exact year historians assign to her passing, remained deeply woven into the identity of the Windward Maroons because leadership of that strength does not fade quickly. It settles into the soil and becomes part of the foundation upon which a community stands. In Moortown and nearby settlements, the rhythm of daily life slowly shifted toward growth. Children born into freedom learned farming, hunting, tracking, and the use of the arbeng, not for constant battle but for communication and ceremony. Elders insisted that readiness must always remain because agreements with empire can weaken with time, and trust created from necessity is never the same as trust created from loyalty. Maroon society therefore evolved into a disciplined and self-governed structure, balancing independence with careful cooperation, while remaining determined never again to face chains without organized resistance. Colonial authorities, on their side, watched the Maroons closely. Some plantation owners still looked at them with suspicion, while others accepted the treaty as a practical compromise. Although open warfare had ended, tension continued beneath the surface. The simple existence of free black settlements challenged the belief that slavery was natural or permanent. Enslaved people across Jamaica heard stories of Nanny and the Maroons, stories that quietly traveled through plantation fields and market days, reminding those still in chains that resistance had succeeded once and might succeed again. This psychological influence worried colonial leaders just as much as earlier raids had done, because ideas travel beyond walls and fences. Nanny's name itself became an idea, a symbol of what determined leadership could achieve even under the heavy weight of empire. In this chapter, her influence moved beyond physical territory and entered imagination, shaping how freedom itself was understood on the island. Over time, the Maroons participated in limited cooperation with colonial forces, as required by treaty agreements. Yet they maintained a distinct identity with cultural traditions rooted in African heritage, spiritual beliefs, communal leadership, and land ownership protected by the treaty. Historians note that this arrangement created a unique social structure within Jamaica, neither fully absorbed into plantation society nor completely separated from colonial systems. Navigating such a position required constant political awareness, a continuation of the strategic thinking that had defined Nanny's leadership. Elders passed down lessons about flexibility, about knowing when to speak firmly and when to remain silent, about protecting unity above personal ambition. These teachings reflected the very principles Nanny herself had practiced, because her success had never depended only on strength. It depended on discipline, intelligence, and shared purpose. As decades passed and new generations rose, who had never seen the earliest mountain battles, the story of Nanny became both history and legend. It was told beside fires at night, carried through songs, woven deeply into identity. With every retelling, the central truth remained clear. She had stood when standing seemed impossible. She had organized people when chaos threatened to destroy them. She had negotiated when endless bloodshed loomed. And she had transformed scattered escapees into a respected and recognized community. Chapter 6 closes not with dramatic conflict, but with lasting presence. because the true measure of resistance is not always the loud sound of battle. Sometimes it is the survival of identity across time. In the mountains of Jamaica, across time, the name Nanny continued echoing long after muskets had fallen silent, shaping memory, guiding behavior, and reminding each generation that freedom must be protected not only with courage, but also with wisdom, patience, and unity. Now the air above the Blue Mountains felt heavy with expectation, as news reached Nanny that the British were preparing their largest expedition yet. Unlike earlier patrols, this force would not move carelessly. It would advance with strategy, with guides who knew certain trails, and with orders that allowed no return without success. When this information reached her settlement, she did not panic. Instead, she calmly called her captains and presented a plan that showed her deeper understanding of both the land and human thinking. She knew that overwhelming force could sometimes defeat smaller resistance groups, but she also understood that large armies move slowly, require more supplies, and depend heavily on coordination. If that coordination could be broken, confusion would grow quickly. She divided her fighters into small units, placed along narrow ridges where visibility was poor. She ordered false paths to be created to mislead guides, and positioned trusted watchers high above valleys, where they could observe movement long before soldiers reached Maroon territory. By the time British columns began climbing the hills, the traps were already waiting. Yet this chapter would not be remembered only for a simple ambush. It would reveal something even more important about Nanny's leadership, her ability to adapt when survival hung by the thinnest thread. The first clash of this campaign exploded at dawn while fog still covered the slopes. Musket shots cracked sharply against rock walls and echoed in strange directions. British soldiers struggled to locate the attackers because sound moved unpredictably through the mountain air, and Maroon fighters shifted quickly from one position to another, firing and then disappearing into dense forest. Confusion spread rapidly among Colonial troops, who expected clear battle lines. Despite this early advantage, the large size of the British force created constant pressure, unlike earlier encounters. As hours passed, the fighting grew heavier. Smoke thickened across the slopes, and both sides felt the exhaustion of a long struggle. At one critical moment, Nanny made a decision that would shape this chapter. Instead of trying to hold every defensive line, she ordered a controlled retreat toward higher ground, sacrificing certain positions in order to protect her core fighters. This decision showed her refusal to confuse pride with strategy, because she understood that preserving leadership mattered more than holding temporary territory. Some warriors hesitated at first, but she spoke firmly and reminded them that living to fight another day is not defeat. It is careful calculation. As the British advanced deeper into areas they believed had been weakened, they soon discovered that the retreat had drawn them into even harsher terrain. Steep slopes slowed their progress. Supply carriers struggled under heavy loads, and narrow trails forced soldiers into long-stretched formations, vulnerable to sudden attacks from the sides. Once again, the Maroons used the mountains themselves as their greatest weapon. Maroon fighters attacked with careful planning, aiming at supply routes instead of the front lines. They destroyed food stores and ammunition that the large army depended on. Soon hunger and deep fatigue started weakening British morale, and quiet murmurs of frustration reached officers who had earlier promised an easy and quick victory. In the middle of this growing struggle, Nanny continued directing movements with calm focus, using the abong horn to signal changes in position, sending trusted messengers along hidden mountain paths to redirect groups, and keeping a steady presence that reassured her people even while the confrontation became more intense than anything they had faced before. During those tense days, the mountains themselves seemed filled with nervous energy. Every shaking branch carried meaning. Every faraway echo hinted at movement, and the feeling of fear slowly began turning back toward the empire that had once used it as a weapon against others. Yet Chapter 3 is not only about movements on the battlefield. It is also about the psychological turning point that followed these events, when the British expedition began to fail and later withdrew without achieving the capture they wanted. Something inside Jamaica's colonial thinking shifted permanently. The belief that the Maroons could easily be destroyed slowly disappeared, replaced by a growing understanding that a long war would drain resources and threaten the stability of the plantations. That realization quietly started planting the early seeds of negotiation, even though open discussion of such talks would take time to appear. For Nanny and her followers, the result strengthened their belief that organized resistance could survive even the biggest military campaigns. In the quiet moments after the retreat, she gathered her community again and reminded them that alertness must never fade simply because victory had been achieved for the moment. Empires rarely abandon ambition completely, and as the smoke cleared from the valleys and calm returned to the forest, both sides realized that the struggle had moved into a new stage, where endurance rather than sudden triumph would shape the island's future. At the center of that unfolding story stood Nanny, not only as a warrior, but also as a strategist whose choices had shifted the balance between authority and resistance in the heart of Jamaica's mountains. The weeks following the failed British expedition did not bring real peace to the mountains. Instead, they created a strange silence that felt even more dangerous than open combat, because both sides were thinking carefully, calculating, and preparing for whatever might come next. Nanny understood clearly that when an empire pauses, it does not mean surrender. It usually means the strategy is changing. Because of this, she strengthened discipline inside her community. She reorganized guard rotations, improved food storage, and expanded communication networks with enslaved workers who still remained trapped on plantations. She made sure no one confused temporary relief with permanent safety, because she believed the British were now considering a different path. Negotiation with an empire is never simple. It always carries risks that can divide resistance movements from the inside. In colonial towns, arguments became louder. Plantation owners complained about financial damage. Soldiers spoke openly about their exhaustion in the mountains. Officials began asking whether endless war against the Maroons was truly worth the cost, because sugar profits required stability, and instability threatened wealth more than wounded pride could justify. Slowly, the idea of a treaty began circulating among British authorities, not because they respected the Maroons deeply, but because they understood how difficult it would be to destroy them completely. When news of possible talks reached the mountains, some Maroons reacted with suspicion. Many feared betrayal. Others worried that peace might demand surrender. At that moment, Nanny's leadership faced a different kind of challenge, not against gunfire, but against doubt within her own people. She called for a gathering in Nanny Town, where elders, captains, and families came together beneath the open sky. There she spoke carefully about the meaning of freedom, explaining that freedom protected through negotiation could sometimes save more lives than freedom pursued through endless war. But she also warned clearly that any agreement must protect their land and independence, not reduce them to servants of the crown. Her words were thoughtful and balanced. She did not rush toward compromise, yet she also refused to cling blindly to conflict. She reminded everyone that the survival of their community remained the highest goal. This calm reasoning eased many fears, because her people trusted that she would never give away their independence lightly. When representatives from the British side eventually arrived with proposals, she listened closely and weighed each condition with the same strategic mind that had guided her during battles in the mountains. The treaty discussions that followed were tense and full of mistrust. British officials demanded peace and cooperation. The Maroons demanded recognition of their freedom and the right to live on their lands. Even though Nanny herself did not personally sign the final document recorded in history, her influence strongly shaped the position from which the Windward Maroons negotiated. When the treaty was finally agreed upon in the year 1739, it granted the Maroons land and official acknowledgement of their autonomy in exchange for peace and certain responsibilities. This agreement marked an important shift in the island's power structure, because for the first time the British Empire formally recognized that these formerly enslaved people could not simply be erased through force alone. Historians still debate the complete impact of that treaty, but one fact remains clear. Nanny's many years of resistance created the pressure that made negotiation possible, as the mountains moved into a new phase defined less by open war and more by cautious coexistence. Her legacy grew deeper. She had forced an empire to acknowledge those it once treated as property. That recognition, even though imperfect, helped reshape the path of Jamaican history. As the 19th century began, and the British Empire tightened its control over Caribbean economics, while slowly facing growing moral and political pressure against slavery, the legacy of Nanny and the Maroons entered another stage, shaped not by immediate battle, but by memory, reform, and gradual transformation. Chapter 9 unfolds during a time when the very system that had caused so much suffering in Jamaica began facing serious criticism from voices across the Atlantic world. Abolitionist movements grew stronger in Britain. Debates in Parliament questioned the morality and long-term stability of the slave trade. Although change moved slowly, it carried deep consequences for islands like Jamaica, where plantation wealth depended heavily on forced labor. Within this changing environment, Maroon settlements continued existing as a living example that enslaved Africans were capable of governing themselves, organizing military defense, and preserving cultural identity. Their existence challenged old narratives that had once claimed bondage was natural or necessary. This contradiction quietly influenced larger discussions about race, freedom, and political ability. When Britain abolished the slave trade in the year 1807, it marked an important turning point, though slavery itself continued for several decades afterwards. When full emancipation was finally declared in 1834, followed by a period of apprenticeship and eventual freedom, Jamaica entered a time of social upheaval and rebuilding. During that uncertain period, the earlier struggles of the Maroons gained renewed symbolic meaning. Emancipation did not erase inequality, nor did it instantly create stability. Newly freed populations faced difficult transitions, while colonial authorities attempted to reorganize labor systems. Through these adjustments, the Maroons continued maintaining their unique status under treaty, reminding the island that freedom achieved through organized resistance had existed in the mountains long before it reached the plantations. This continuity strengthened a deeper sense of history within Jamaican society, linking emancipation not only to British laws, but also to African resistance that had come before them. As economic changes and political tensions shaped the island throughout the 19th century, including uprisings such as the Morant Bay Rebellion in 1865, debates about justice, representation, and governance grew stronger. Later historians noticed that memories of Maroon resistance influenced how colonial authorities reacted to unrest, because earlier conflicts had shown the dangers of underestimating organized defiance in difficult terrain. Although the Maroons themselves did not repeat the large-scale wars of earlier decades, their presence remained an important and cautious reminder within Jamaican politics, representing both cooperation and independence at the same time. Inside their communities, cultural traditions rooted in Arcan heritage continued blending with Caribbean experience. Language patterns, drumming rhythms, herbal knowledge, and ceremonial practices were preserved carefully, connecting new generations to ancestors who had crossed the Atlantic in chains, yet refused to abandon their identity. By the time the 20th century approached and Jamaica slowly moved toward greater political self-rule, eventually gaining independence in 1962, Nanny's name had moved beyond local legend and entered national consciousness. Recognized officially as a national hero whose resistance shaped the island's past, monuments and statues built in her honor symbolized more than simple remembrance. They represented the reclaiming of a story, the understanding that Jamaica's journey toward sovereignty was influenced not only by colonial officials or parliamentary decisions, but also by a woman who stood in the mountains centuries earlier and refused to submit. In universities and academic institutions, her story later became the subject of research, examining gender, warfare, spirituality, and diplomacy within the wider context of the African diaspora, while in cultural memory her legacy continued inspiring conversations about resistance, leadership, and the enduring meaning of freedom. Cultural life. Her image started appearing in literature, music, and visual art, inspiring new generations to think about the meaning of bravery and leadership. And so, Chapter 9 ends with a deep realization that Nanny of the Maroons did not simply guide resistance during her lifetime. She shaped the psychological and political landscape of Jamaica for many centuries, influencing how freedom was imagined, protected, and eventually established. And her story stands as a lasting reminder that organized resistance against empire can change the course of history long after the first gunshots fade into silence. As we step into this final chapter, the mountains stand like quiet witnesses to everything that has taken place. Mist still drifts across the blue mountains, just as it did hundreds of years ago. The wind still moves through the tall trees, as if carrying the echoes of distant voices. And within that wind there remains a story that refuses to disappear. The story of Nanny of the Maroons. A woman taken in chains, who rose to lead a resistance that forced the British Empire to accept what it once tried to destroy. And when we look back across her life, we do not see only ambushes and musket fire. We see wisdom shaped by struggle. We see discipline created from necessity. We see leadership formed in the most difficult conditions imaginable. And we see something greater than battle. We see the transformation of fear into strategy and strategy into freedom. Because Nanny understood that survival required more than simple bravery. It required unity, communication, spiritual strength, and the ability to adjust when situations changed. And through these qualities, she turned scattered escapees into an organized movement. She turned mountains into powerful fortresses. She turned uncertainty into direction, and she forced an empire built on expansion to stop and negotiate. And that pause changed the history of Jamaica forever. Her legacy did not finish when the treaty was signed. It did not end when she left this world. It continued through generations who carried her lessons in their everyday lives, through children who grew up free in the mountains, through elders who shared her story evening fires, through communities that protected their culture despite centuries of colonial pressure, and even long after slavery ended and Jamaica moved toward independence. Her name stood as clear proof that resistance was not new to the island. It was deeply rooted in its soil, and in modern times when she was named a national hero, her recognition was not a gift from history. It was a return of truth, an acknowledgement that freedom on that island was shaped not only by political papers, but also by a woman who refused to bow down. And scholars still study her life. Artists continue painting her image. Musicians keep singing her name because she represents something universal. The idea that even within systems designed to erase humanity, leadership built on courage and wisdom can bend the direction of power. When we reflect on her journey, we must understand that it was not simple. It carried sacrifice. It carried moral challenges. It carried moments of doubt and heavy responsibility. Yet through all of it, she chose endurance instead of surrender. And that decision echoes across centuries because empires rise, believing they will last forever. Yet history shows us that permanence is only an illusion. What truly remains is the spirit of those who challenge injustice with clarity and determination. And Nanny did exactly that. She challenged not only the British military, but also the belief that enslaved Africans were powerless. She proved that organization could stand against stronger weapons. She proved that unity could defeat division, and she proved that identity could survive displacement. And today, when we speak her name, we are not only remembering the past, we are also recognizing a model for resilience in the present. And now, as we close this powerful story here on History of Forgotten Souls, we ask you to reflect carefully. What part of Nanny's journey stayed with you the most? Was it her escape into the mountains, her strategy against British forces, her role in shaping a treaty that changed history, or the way her legacy continued into modern Jamaica? Tell us in the comments where you are watching from, your city, your country, and what time it is right now, because this community spreads across the world, just like her story has traveled across centuries. If you have not already subscribed, make sure you subscribe to History of Forgotten Souls and like this video so more people can discover the forgotten heroes who helped shape our world. Share this story with someone who believes that true history deserves to be remembered. And stay with us, because the next forgotten soul we explore may change the way you see the past forever. Until next time, remember this. History is not only written by empires, it is also written by those who refuse to vanish.